The Atlanta Constitution is one of this country's great newspapers. For 104 years, a leading voice for liberal and progressive ideas in the South. Today, the Constitution prides itself on sustaining the editorial courage which won it 4 Pulitzer Prizes in the past. The daily deliberations of its editorial board are held symbolically under the portrait of its famous and outspoken late editor, Ralph McGill. Under McGill and others, the Constitution has weathered many storms, but few that can have tormented the conscience of its editors so much as the dilemma the newspaper faced in this presidential election. The Constitution has never formally endorsed a Republican candidate. What should it do this year, with most of the South apparently poised to throw itself gratefully at Mr. Nixon's feet? To endorse or not to endorse? That was the question they faced as Mr. Nixon came to Atlanta 2 weeks ago.
Tonight, to endorse or not to endorse? That was the question. With NPAC senior correspondent Robert MacNeil.
Good evening. This is the time in every presidential campaign when people begin counting which candidate has been endorsed by the most newspapers. Almost always, the Republican candidate gets the overwhelming majority of endorsements for the simple reason that most newspaper publishers are Republican. It's been argued for years that endorsements really don't make that much difference anyway, that many papers follow public opinion and don't lead it. What's really important is what appears on the news pages. But whatever the effect, newspaper endorsements are still part of the folklore of American politics. This year, Richard Nixon has a wider margin of endorsements than any Republican has had over his Democratic opponent since the 30s. We went to Atlanta to record the discussion within one famous Democratic newspaper, the Atlanta Constitution, over whether to endorse Mr. Nixon or Senator McGovern. The president himself was due in Atlanta the next day. No advance effort was spared by the Republicans to turn on a tumultuous welcome for the coming of their political messiah. High school bands lined the motorcade route. Thousands of signs were prepared. Crowds were bussed in from special free parking lots. Security precautions were especially tight along crowded Peachtree Street. Mr. Nixon had made 2 other triumphal visits to Atlanta in 1960 and 68, and his advance men wanted this one to look even bigger. Tons of paper were shredded in advance and pumped out by machines to ensure a photogenic effect for the press. And while all these preparations were underway in the conference room of the Atlanta Constitution the day before, editor Reg Murphy and his associates agonized over which candidate to endorse.
Let's go back through the presidential campaign one more time and see whether or not we can agree on some of the issues that we ought to touch on when we come down on one side or another. First of all, I assume that because of what we did in some Senate races and other things, that nobody in the room really wants to not endorse or do you? Okay, I guess then the best thing to do is to start with what everybody feels about the McGovern campaign and whether or not it's made its point.
When it started out, we wrote editorials saying, at last, this is going to be a campaign of issues. We don't have 2 personality kids running against each other. Charisma's out. We're going to talk about the hard facts. And we haven't. They haven't come up. What it has boiled down to is a personality contest between 2 fellows who don't have personalities.
I think the issues are there, Red, but they've been talked about before the campaign ever got started. The Vietnam War, which is the big one. that was talked about before the campaign. It was talked about last night.
But I think the war would not be where it is right now without the pressure from McGovern. If McGovern had been breathing on his neck, Nixon's neck all this time, this war wouldn't be any further along than what it is.
What's the line that Robert Kennedy's supposed to have said about McGovern, that he was the only decent man in the Senate? I suspect he's probably a more decent man than President Nixon in a lot of ways, and that probably there were issues there on Vietnam and some other things, certainly domestic issues on civil rights and welfare reform, in which conceivably he could have made a very strong case for defeating Nixon. And you could be talking about a horse race. I think what we're talking about, though, is a campaign in which one side of it has never gotten off the ground, that McGovern has never, aside from the issues, which I think he had, I mean, Nixon's got some issues too, but McGovern's got things you can make a good case on. But it seems to me that after his handling, maybe even of the convention, going back to the California challenge, but then certainly the vice presidential choice on Eagleton, the whole mess, that somehow he's never managed to get off the ground, that he's not been able to convince anything close even to 50% of the voters that he's really a viable alternative to Nixon in the White House as President of the United States. People don't believe McGovern can be President of the United States.
So what you're saying is there may be an issue of competence, that may be the...
I think he represents things that are morally right, but he apparently doesn't know how to carry them out. I think he wanted to represent the average man, the little man, well, which I don't think the other side does.
This election marks the beginning of a new era in the political alignment of the South and of the nation. For 100 years, one party took the South for granted, and the other party, as a matter of fact, wrote it off. Now, that has entirely changed. Neither party is going to take the South for granted, and neither party can afford to write it off. This is going to be good for the South. It's going to be good for the nation. I have seen this develop. This is not the first time that we have had a motorcade in Atlanta. The first was in 1960. It was one of the most exciting motorcades of the entire campaign. It was a huge crowd, an enthusiastic crowd, not as big as today, but big.
Now, isn't it strange that here we are sitting in this room talking about this campaign in a peculiar moral atmosphere. The top story in the paper this morning has to do with the fact that there has been espionage in most of the Democratic campaigns, apparently directed from the, or at least alleged to have been directed from the campaign to re-elect the president, and that the country doesn't get very much involved anymore in worrying about whether one political party is spying on another. The whole civil liberties question that we've been talking about for all these years doesn't seem to be having much impact in the country, does it?
Well, Barley said a moment ago that McGovern represented what was morally right with the country. Does that mean that we think Nixon is representing what's morally wrong with the country?
Some of these things, like breaking and entering in a national party committee headquarters, that, and I think it's back to McGovern as a viable presidential candidate, that if he were considered by a great percentage of the people as a real alternative, then things like the Watergate break-in would be much more of an issue. But I think people tuned out.
But there was a time in the South when any Southerner would vote for any Democrat and never vote for a Republican. What this new political development is that we see in this election, and I think will be reflected in this election, in Georgia and throughout the southern states, is that is no longer going to be true. Candidates of either party are going to have to seek support not on the basis of the party label, but on the basis of what they believe. And people of the South are going to vote for the man or the woman rather than the party.
Nobody that I know is really voting on a positive basis here. Everybody's sort of trying to pick the least destructive course, it seems to me, in American politics at the moment. And that's what we really have to try to deal with, is what is the least destructive.
You know, maybe we sound so negative about it because Senator McGovern, I don't think, really has convinced most of us that he represents the center even of the Democratic Party in this country. And that maybe he's really not a viable candidate in opposition to Nixon. I mean, we've been through some of these things, but there were other potential Democratic Party nominees that I think we could cheerfully have supported against President Nixon, as this newspaper endorsed Hubert Humphrey in 1968. But the problem with McGovern is whether or not he's someone you can view as a real alternative to President Nixon.
And let's be honest about it, as the kind of guy that the Democrats have always put up in this newspaper is almost invariably in its long history supported. There's not anybody in this room who doesn't feel the presence of that portrait on the wall, McGill looking down. There is not any possibility that any of us ever escape the heritage of what this newspaper is all about when we sit down and try to deal with this. But the trouble is that the Democratic Party has not dealt with its own heritage and its own national leadership this year. You're exactly right. It froze the middle of the Democratic Party out of the party. It froze people like us who have been trying to deal with issues in a more middle-of-the-road kind of way out of it. When the Democratic Party sort of adopted as a watchword at its convention, "Don't eat lettuce," that didn't really represent what most of us thought the tradition of the Democratic Party was all about. And I think that's what really traps everybody in this room. The agony everybody's been through, it seems to me, is that we haven't been given any reason to believe that there is more competence than the obvious incompetence that we have seen so far, beginning at the convention, and everything since has been designed almost to alienate the people that we know and that we write for every day.
If you got quest a little, you know. Need big crowds that get squashed. Let me see. You're with the fire or? No, I'm Atlanta Transit. Oh, the transit. Oh, yes, right. Well, good to see you. Yes, sir. I like that.
These are the issues that make most Southerners potential members of what we call the new American majority. First, they want this country to be strong. Not because they want the United States to be strong for jingoistic reasons, although Southerners have a great deal of national pride, but because they know that a strong United States is the guardian of peace in the world and the guardian of freedom.
But it seems to me that our traditional concern about President Nixon includes things like real honest-to-goodness worry about whether he understands that civil liberties in this country are valuable and worth preserving, that he understands that quality as opposed to some kind of political attitude is an important attribute for a man who goes to the Supreme Court. Whether he understands that this country wants to turn itself around, doesn't want to put as much of its blood and treasure into Southeast Asia, and wants to put more of its treasure into trying to build this country.
Most Southerners and most Americans, East, West, North, and South, want respect for law, respect for order, and they want justice to all people. I have made some appointments to the Supreme Court. I've made appointments to other courts. I've selected men and women that I consider to be good lawyers. But one thing that I insist upon for all appointees is this: they must recognize that the first civil right of every American, whatever he may be, what he wants is to be free from domestic violence.
Well, you know, and you talk about reasons that it would be difficult to endorse Nixon. I think one of the big ones has got to be not just the Supreme Court appointments, but his record on civil rights generally, which obviously this newspaper has been very directly concerned with. But, I mean, going back to the first 2 years of his administration, it seems to me there's a pretty good case that the president played every kind of demagogic politics with almost every racial level of civil rights.
Well, just on the basis that what we've said here, Why is it hard to make a decision?
Well, it's tough because the whole tradition of what this newspaper is all about. Tough because McGill's portrait hanging on that wall is a part of Americana, a part of what the South's all about, and he really does live with this. And because, damn it, he would have been agonizing like we have been trying to agonize all summer about what it is that you do. And I don't want to follow his footsteps precisely to every toe print in the sand, but I do want to know.
But the portrait represents responsible leadership, not following some liberal line, not just knee-jerk stuff. You have to do what's right. You have to make a choice. Either George McGovern or Richard Nixon is going to be the President of the United States. Now, which is it going to, who do we say we favor most?
John Schmidt's much of a chance.
Well, the reason
I was going to suggest that since the main thing we all agree that Nixon has done that's great is Russia and China, that we ought to endorse Kissinger. Just forget about it. Yeah.
Okay, that's
Somebody said if Kissinger died, Nixon would be president.
that's too macabre for this high and distinguished editorial board to talk about. The real reason you get into this dilemma is because if we could really make a reasonable and responsible case for the Democratic nominee for President of the United States, we wouldn't be in this dilemma, right?
People of the South want an opportunity for good jobs, high wages, and cost of living kept under control so that you're not on a treadmill. High prices are an issue in the South. Taxes are an issue in the South. Jobs are an issue in the South. That's why most Southerners, I have found, approve of this administration's policies.
If you really could say that you believe George McGovern was more competent or better qualified to be president of the United States than Richard Nixon, I mean, I think we could deal with other things, differences in issue. I don't think I can say that. I don't happen to admire Mr. Nixon on a lot of fronts, but I think on the record of what I know of both of them, Nixon is better qualified to be president of the United States. And I don't say it easily. I mean, I'd rather say that the Democratic nominee was
in your
the
case,
best
that's got to be
qualified
about the
man.
most painful thing you've ever said.
I don't know anybody here that likes Nixon. I mean, just as a human being, I don't think I do.
If you're going to be honest, like you're talking about, it seems to me that as partisan as these things are, and they've got to be, you still really get down to trying to say that one of these two men is better equipped for whatever combination of reasons to be president of the United States right now.
I'm saying that we're assuming because McGovern's campaign has been so sloppy since the convention that he's an incompetent person. But I think that he got into a situation in the Eagleton thing. Reg is right that he could have turned it around later. But I'm just not all that certain that he's so incompetent.
All you really know about him, as a national figure who might be president, is the kind of campaign he ran for the nomination and has run since. And everybody, even the people who love him dearly, seem to think he's raised the question of competence, really.
People of the South are just like the rest of the country in wanting progress. They don't want to stand still. You look at this great skyline of the city of Atlanta. Look at New Orleans. Look at Texas. Look across this whole area. Florida, for example, North Carolina, Tennessee. And you can see that the progress in this part of the country, along with the West, is probably the greatest of all of the nation.
If you start talking about what the Constitution ought to stand for now, it ought to still stand for the humanity and individual dignity that McGill talked about all of his life. People who can get on with the business of government, people who can exhibit some kind of leadership, people who can make things work, people who have some heart and soul and feeling for what the country is all about, everybody in the country. Some attitude that individuals have the right to pursue different goals and aims and ideals. And those are the things that I simply have not heard expressed in this political campaign.
If you were to ask me whether I thought President Nixon represented some of the ideals that Reg has just gone through, I don't know. You'd really have to convince me on that.
Of course, none of us know that. None of us really feels that. Maybe you do, but the rest of us are concerned whether that has been a part of any political campaign this year. My feeling is that it has not been a part of the political campaigns this year, and it should have been.
But Reg, if we were to go with Nixon, wouldn't we be perpetuating the same thing for another 4 years?
And the problem with that is that none of us wants to perpetuate that for another 4 years. On the other hand, the uncertainty of the other campaign is so tragic that none of us can bring ourselves to be enthusiastic about it. Not a soul at this table has been able to ever get enthusiastic about this campaign.
There is, in this part of the country, a deep religious faith. There is a great respect for moral values. There is a great devotion to what we call character. Oh, you can call them old-fashioned, but the day America loses its moral values, its dedication to idealism and religion, this will cease to be a great country. We're not going to let that happen.
After all the other arguments have been completed in a presidential campaign, voters finally must decide on the competence of the candidates. Richard Nixon has shown the world he is competent to be the president. Senator George McGovern has failed to convince us that he has the competence to run the country. The Atlanta Constitution endorses President Nixon for re-election and urges that the voters of this nation support him. The voting public must decide what it seeks in a president. Party affiliation is a valid experience. In the South, it has been one of the most important factors in elections. None can say it is an overstressed element because political parties have given shape and stability to the American political system. In this case, however, many Democrats will wish to cross to the Republican side in voting for a presidential candidate. Under Georgia law, it is possible to vote for President Nixon and then vote for Democrats. Such a procedure is not complicated. It can be seen clearly on the sample ballots available in polling places. The Constitution believes that Richard Nixon is a more competent president than George McGovern would be. Nixon should get this state's votes this November.
A lot of the Constitution's readers were outraged by the endorsement, which Reg Murphy and his colleagues had arrived at so reluctantly. The editors deliberately filled the letters column with hostile letters. Corliss A. Barnes of Atlanta said, "The pressure of advertising money must be great, is the spirit and fight of Ralph McGill gone forever." A lady in Decatur said she found the paper's reasoning incredible. "You actually list," she said, "Vietnam, the economy, special interest influences, the ITT affair, the Watergate affair, and the campaign contributions problem as areas where the president has failed, and you still find him competent enough for the honorable position of the presidency. My God, in that case, the Godfather should be a perfect choice for the job." An Atlanta man wrote, "You have plainly abdicated your role as the spokesman for decency in a troubled South by sheepishly falling in behind the Nixon bandwagon." Kenneth Bass of Adairsville told the Constitution, "By endorsing Richard Nixon, you have repudiated everything your paper previously stood for." One letter struck quite a different note. It was from President Nixon himself. It made no reference to the endorsement, but thanked the people of Atlanta for their warm and generous welcome. It's not very often that one can see inside the soul of a great newspaper in the throes of an important moral debate, as we've just done. That in itself is interesting. But we've carried their discussion at such length because we think the content says a great deal about this election. If the national polls are generally correct now, and there's no massive shift in opinion, Mr. Nixon is going to be comfortably reelected. And he's going to be reelected by Democrats. There are not enough Republicans to do the job, and the polls show that about 1/3 of Mr. Nixon's support comes from disaffected Democrats. And thousands of them must have gone through, or are now going through, the agony we've just witnessed in this Democratic newspaper. They do not like Mr. Nixon personally. In fact, some dislike him. They do not credit him with giving moral leadership. They have serious question about whether, as Reg Murphy put it, Mr. Nixon understands that civil liberties in this country are worth preserving. Yet, with all those matters lying heavily on their consciences, many Democrats tell the pollsters they're going to vote for him. Why? The men at the Constitution narrowed it down to competence. Mr. Nixon they describe as competent. Senator McGovern has not yet proved his competence. They praise Mr. Nixon for being a flexible man, willing to adjust to the realities of this world. They also see flexibility in Senator McGovern, but do not find that admirable. It's the word competence that reveals a lot about this presidential election. Competence is not a very inspiring quality to be looking for in a national leader. It is the prosaic attribute. It is the very minimum standard. A business corporation would probably send out again to the Executive Talent Agency for better material if it found it had to choose a president merely on the basis of competence. A corporation would be looking for imagination, flair, and ability to inspire. Perhaps a little moral uplift as well. In short, they'd be looking for leadership. But a lot of Democrats apparently made up their minds a long time ago that they'd better settle, grudgingly, for the competence of Richard Nixon than gamble on George McGovern. It is a negative reason for supporting Nixon. Now some Democrats are moving back to McGovern, again largely for negative, anti-Nixon reasons. It's a melancholy prospect that millions of young Americans are going to get their first taste of participatory democracy in a race to decide which presidential candidate turns off more voters. I'm Robert MacNeil. Good night for NPACT.
Next week on A Public Affair, the president's coattails. Senator Vanocur and Peter Kay look at key congressional races and the Republican drive to win control of the House and the Senate. On election eve, representatives of Senator McGovern and of President Nixon will appear on an NPAC special broadcast to answer questions about their candidates' positions. If you have a question for the representative of President Nixon or Senator McGovern on election eve, send it on a postcard to Election 72, Post Office Box 28056, Washington, D.C. 20005. This has been a production of NPACT, the National Public Affairs Center for Television.